Welcome everyone for this Monday morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are around the world. My name is Karine Ardill. I'm co-chairing ESWN event with Rimat, who doesn't have her name because she's questioned at ESWN. We are so happy to have you here today for this panel discussion on a very, very important topic, startup and negotiation in academic position. This is part of a series we have been having in the last year here in ESWN. So we're very excited to have you here with us today. So what to expect for today? We're going to have a little bit of introduction. You're going to hear about ESWN if you're not familiar with it. We're going to hear about the speaker experience. They're going to tell us about their experience when it comes to the startup and negotiation aspect. We're going to have a panel discussion, which is based on question you sent us. And we're also going to have a breakout room where you can join each one of the speaker room and have a more close talk and get to know our speaker better. And then we're going to close up the event and send you all for the rest of your day. Just some technical information. All of you are written in as ESWN event attendancy. If you would like to change it to your name, please by all means do it. You don't have to. You can stay anonymous this way. If you would like to turn on your camera, especially in the breakout room, by all means do that. If you have any technical issues or any question and you prefer not to put them in the chat, you can send them to question@ESWN. This is Rimat, our co-chair, and she will post them in the question anonymously to make sure that your question will stay anonymous. All right, so just a few housekeeping. Please abide. Well, you all did sign that you did read the ESWN Code of Conduct, and Rima's going to put it in a chat in a second. So we really want this event to be respectful. We really want to be able to have this event. So far, we've been very fortunate not to have any issues in ESWN event, and we're really hoping that will continue. This event is recorded at least up to the breakout room, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you have to leave, feel free to check it later on our YouTube. It's fully closed caption, and you will be muted for the duration of the event. You will be able to turn on your mic during the breakout room to ask a question. Again, if you have any technical issues or if you have any question, please send them to question@ESWN. If this is your first ESWN event, welcome. And we hope this will be one of many more you'll join us for. ESWN is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing diversity across the geoscience, emphasizing on creating, supporting, nutrienting community. And we're doing these events, and we're always happy to hear more feedback from you. So if you have any ideas for future event, please contact us, because most of the event that we have been performing over the last 3 years came up from a feedback we got from you in a survey we had a long time ago. So please send us to our email, ESWN event@eswn.org. If you have any ideas for new event or future event that we can do, all our events are posted on our YouTube channel, so you're more than welcome to go check them out. In addition, we are looking for volunteer and people to replace us. We're getting into the end of our term, and we need more motivated people, especially those with some experience organizing event, because we need the next ESWN leading generation. So please contact us also if you're interested. All right, that was a long introduction. Let's get right through our event. So startup negotiation, what does it mean? If you're wondering about what that phase looks like, this is what we're going to get to discover. So we've had several events free for this event. We've already had an event last year to talk about two-body problem. We've talked about what does it mean to apply for a university for a position. Now, although it's similar around the world and in the US, we are focusing in US just because there's little nuance. So this event, is dedicated for US application, but other participants from around the world can learn as well. All right, so we learn about how to apply for a position. We've learned about the interview process, and now you got to a point that you actually got the job. You got an offer. But what does it mean? Now you have to start thinking about what to do. So you found a place you would like to apply, you submitted your application package, you were invited to the on-site, you got the offer. So what's next? The most important thing you need to think about is where are you got the offer? Is it a teaching institute or a research institute? And what do you need to build your lab? So that's going to mean a lot of work on your hand, and we're going to hear that in a second from each one of our panelists. How do you do your homework? And what do you need to make sure you cover? Not just negotiating your salary, which is super important, but how do you make sure you have all the facility and all the instrument you're going to need to do your work? So, with no further ado, I want to let each of the speaker a chance to introduce herself, and they will tell us about their personal journey, how they got into the sport of the startup, and also a bit of their experience. So we have three speaker coming up. We're going to have Dr. Katie from Texas Tech University. We're going to have Mayra Oyola-Merced from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Natasha Calhoun from Occident College. So three different institutes. Our first speaker to introduce herself will be Dr. Maya Oyola-Merced. Mayra, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So, thank you for having me here. I know for most of you listening or participating in this workshop, you are probably super excited or getting ready to apply for faculty positions. So it is a very exciting time, and I realize it's also a very nervous-wracking time. As Karen said, I'm Dr. Mayra Oyola-Merced. I am originally from Puerto Rico, where all of my love for environmental sciences began. If you ever heard of Puerto Rico, you probably have heard about hurricanes and also other, sadly, severe weather events that have affected the island. So that kind of triggered me or motivated me to look into atmospheric sciences as a career. Um, my background is in theoretical physics from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and I got my PhD at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Then after that, I was one of those people that said, I will never, ever do academia. And I ended up being a professor now. But before I got here, I had a couple of stops. One of them was at the Naval Research Lab in Monterey, California, where I worked for the Department of Defense for about 3 years. And then after I transitioned to the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, where I worked in satellite validation and satellite retrieval. So that's along the lines of my work. Eventually, I started mentoring students, and I got the academic itch. So I applied for a position here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is very well renowned for satellite remote sensing. And I had the great opportunity to get accepted. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the startup process, but what I can tell you is, for me, one thing that helped me at the time was actually having a network of people that have gone through the process. So this is why we're here, to help you and to provide you with any support that we can give. Right now, I am a professor. That startup has been extremely important for me to get my lab situated, to get my students supported throughout the entire process, and to, of course, set myself up to the path where I'm getting funded to my future research. So, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about how that process works. But I think for now, I'm going to let the next speaker introduce themselves, and looking forward to have a little bit more conversations on these topics.
All right. Thank you so much, Mayra. Our next speaker is also a good friend of mine, Katie Ardill. She's coming from Texas Tech University. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Corinne. And hi to everybody at the Zoom room. I'm currently an assistant professor, as Corinne said, at Texas Tech University, and my field of research is in igneous petrology, and specifically the behavior of continental arc systems and processes that shape the long-lived plutonic record that we have there. My research has a really strong field component, but I also enjoy combining those observations with geochemistry from rocks and also minerals. So a lot of lab work involved there as well. And my group are currently exploring questions on the volcanic plutonic connection and magma chamber processes, thinking about how compositionally diverse crust is formed. I'm originally from England, and I completed my PhD in 2020 in the University of Southern California, at which point I started an assistant professor tenure track position at California State University, Sacramento. And that was my first experience with the startup process, which was also during COVID. I most recently then got the opportunity to go through creating a startup package in 2022 for my current job here at Texas Tech. And so I just want to reiterate the importance of the support of people around you to set you up well, because as Mayra said, it's about you, but also about the team that you envisage having over the space of 3 to 5, 6 years. So think long term.
All right. Well, thank you, Katie. So we have two research institute, and now we're going to hear from Natasha Sekho. If I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I'm sorry if I'm not. And you're going to hear a whole different experience from a teaching institute professor. Natasha, the stage is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be on this panel with amazing other female faculty members. I am an assistant professor in a liberal arts college, Occidental College in Los Angeles. And as Karen had mentioned, it is an undergraduate institute. So the way I think about startup was maybe a little different, and I'm excited to talk about that in more detail. As we open up to questions and answer questions. A little bit of background about myself. I was born and raised in India, in Punjab. That's where I fell in love with the monsoon system, thinking about changes in the modern climate as well as the past climate. I am an international scholar, so if people want to talk about visas and making those transitions, happy to talk about that as well. I did my bachelor's in the US at UC Irvine, followed by a master's and PhD at University of Texas in Austin. And I wrapped up my postdoc at Brown University on the East Coast and started as a faculty member in January of 2024. So I'm about to reach the 1-year mark. But yeah, as Mayra and Katie were saying, having a really strong network of people around you is super, super important. We are trained to be geoscientists and earth scientists, and all of a sudden we have to think like a business person, short-term goals, long-term goals, making Excel spreadsheets. So having that administration cap on is super, super important. I did not know what I was doing, so really relying on people around me, whether it be postdocs in the same institute or PhD mentors or postdoc mentors, is super, super helpful. By training, I am a low temperature geochemist. So I think about how past climate has changed, looking at stable isotopes and trace elements in stalagmites in cave systems. I also look at modern climate variability, looking at weather station data and reanalysis data, thinking about, again, monsoon variability, periods of abrupt climate change. Cool.
All right. Thank you so much, Natasha. So now you got to know each one of our speakers. So we're going to move into our panel discussion. I'm going to turn off my camera in a second so we can make sure that you all will have a chance to see our speaker in a better way. But we got the question from you. We try to combine them as much as possible. And we selected several questions out of the question you shared with us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second here. And we're going to start over our question with our first question. And we're going to have Mayra and Natasha who's going to answer this question. Our first question is, what do you need to prepare when you need to set up a startup? Mayra, would you like to go first?
Yes, and as I mentioned, this might be a really stressful moment. You might be really happy because you got the job and you're trying to figure out how things are going to work. But I think Natasha and Katie both mentioned that you don't know. You're coming into academia. You don't have the experience. Every institution works differently. And also we have research institutions and teaching institutions. So how do you handle all this? So the way in which I did it, and this was with help of mentors that had gone through the process. First thing was identifying my essential needs. And so before negotiating, you need to make a comprehensive list of everything that you need for your research. Some things you might be able to negotiate as part of the startup, others you may not. But I think at that point, this is a really good starting point for you to figure out exactly what you need. So things, for example, like lab equipment. For those of you who use lab equipment, or maybe, for example, in my case, my group does a lot of computational work, so I needed a server, space. So all these things you need to detail any specific instrument, any technology that you need, computer resources, software that might be needed for you to do your research or to teach. Sometimes you're gonna have like big item or a big ticket item. Let's say you decide to, I know this was not my case, but one of my colleagues needed a radar. So that's a big item. So you need to make sure that you justify that cost and that purchase is really in alignment with your research. The other thing that's really important when it comes to your startup is personnel, because you're going to most likely be paying your students out of your startup. Do you need a student? Do you need a postdoc? What can you justify for that research? Sometimes you may have already students because you're coming from another institution, or maybe you already have a postdoc. But you need to understand what your career goals are and how that hiring aligns within your startup. And the one thing that you need to really consider is that cost is not just over a year. You need to think about year 1, year 2, year 3, especially if you're not coming with any other source of external funding. Let's say you're starting to write proposals and you haven't even submitted a proposal. Again, do not fret if that's the case. That's what the startup is for. But you also need to think about what are ways in which you're going to sustain or support the staff. Some universities will provide you with some furniture. The case here is that they allowed us to get some furniture in terms of our desk and our computers and things like that that are needed for you to work. Additional things like, for example, if you wanted to have a couch in your office, some universities do provide that, others do not. So, and others do not allow you to take that away from your startup. So that's something that you need to consider when you are negotiating. The other thing, travel for you and your students or whoever is in your group during that year. That's a good question to have. Can you use some of that startup fund to sustain travel? And sometimes the universities may match up that travel fund. For example, for us, we get one international trip every 3 years supported by the university. So that's one thing that should be listed in your startup. It should be written. And if you do need international travel because your research requires it, if there's a conference that you need to attend to that is important for you, that's something that you want to negotiate at the very beginning. I would say that some universities do have a very strict policy about certain things, again, that you can buy, you cannot buy, or that you can get, you cannot get. The startup is not only a point for you to negotiate money and funding, but also, for example, you're moving, what are they giving to you as part of your relocation? That's extremely important, extremely, because moving, especially if you're doing it between countries or across the country, that it becomes expensive. It's really expensive when it gets really crazy really fast, and I've done it a couple of times, and there are also some tax issues, so you got to be very careful, study those, and make sure that the university has ways to support you through that travel that happens. And the other thing is, for example, your teaching load. That is not something that is necessarily an amount of money that you're going to get. But for example, you might get some time off during the first semester from teaching for that allows you to get ready for teaching. So a lot of professors do not teach during the first semester. In my case, I was asked to. So part of that negotiation was, okay, I'm going to teach the first semester, but I hope that at some point I get to have a semester off. So within that negotiation, we had a teaching release, which I'm having now in my third year. And it was great because I came really motivated and I was ready to teach. And now I can use the time to do other things and to do networking and to do a little bit more traveling. So those are things that you may want to take into consideration when we're going through the package. And I think I'm going to let Natasha add on before I get too excited and I talk too much about this.
Thank you, Mayra. That was wonderful because that's a lot of information. Natasha, what about you? What do you think we should consider when we're starting to work on these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I can take off where Mayra had left. I'll also zoom out a little and say I am at a liberal arts college. So for example, my teaching load is at 3-2. That means I'm teaching 3 classes in the fall or in the spring, and then I do the 2 the other way. So and then the research that I'm doing is primarily sort of pushed along by students and then by me in the summer or winter break. Thinking about startups, how I thought about it is it's super exciting. You can make your vision boards. You can be as creative as you want. And I broke it down in 3 categories: salary, teaching, and research, right? So thinking about salary, that's important. Do your homework. Key is homework: bold, capitalize, italics, everything. Figure out your institution, figure out what the salary is for you. If that is negotiable, mine was not. So make sure you at least talk about that. Teaching, as I said, I am in a liberal arts college. I really enjoy teaching. That's what I'm passionate about. But I was able to get a low load for teaching. So I did it 2-1 my first year. Similarly with service, when do you start doing service work? How much of that will be taking up your time? Because if you're not teaching or doing research, service can end up sucking up a lot of your time. And then similarly with research, right? As Mayra was saying, what are your non-negotiables? Like, what are the things that you absolutely need to be a successful faculty member, whichever institution that you're in? So definitely having an ongoing list of just writing these items down in bullet points. It doesn't need to be formalized. You don't have to wait till the time you get a job offer. You guys will get a job offer. Start early, right? So start writing all of these points down. Lab space. What is your lab space? Were you able to visit your lab space when you did an on-site interview? I need a lab space. I use a Picaro instrument and other instruments. How will you be purchasing those? Will those be coming from your startup, or are you expected to write NSF MRIs to get your instruments? What would the upkeep be? Is there a technician, lab technician? Some other items thinking about your startup: publication costs. Hopefully you're coming out of postdocs and you have some papers that are ready to be submitted. It's expensive submitting papers, especially if you're doing accessible, transparent, fair. So add those costs into your startup, because you will have your current institute's name on them. So that's something to keep in mind. Consumables, everything from pipettes to acids to hot plates. What's the infrastructure? Is there a chemistry department that you're purchasing these from? Or will you need to set up accounts with Fisher? Are there discounts? In addition to what Mayra was saying for traveling, our college gives around $1,800 for conference traveling, wherever, international or national. Workshops, will they be factoring in or providing money for you to attend professional development workshops geared towards geoscience faculty members? So anything that you can think about, just keep writing it down. How I did my startup negotiation was with the department chair at the time. So we were going back and forth quite a lot, and then he would advocate for me with the dean. And so there was a lot of communication that was going back and forth, and I necessarily did not have to deal with the dean till the time we made the till the time they made the final offer. So getting to know your department chair, having Zoom calls, phone calls, all of that is super, super important. And then also you're advocating for yourself. So whatever you need to be a successful faculty member for the next 3 years while you're writing grants is what you should be asking for.
Thank you. That's perfect. We heard so many great examples here. Katie, would you like to add any information that was not mentioned?
Only to build on to Natasha's comment about starting early. When you're on the on-campus interview, looking at what already exists in the department and where you can slot in, what would you need to add versus what already exists, and thinking about that lab space. Is it move-in ready, or is there renovation involved, and is that a startup expense or not? Might be important. And thinking about instruments like microscopes, having quotes already prepared at the point where the startup negotiations begin is really helpful, because sometimes they will be required for the approval, and the time between offer and startup negotiations can be quite small. So it's good to have those things ready to go in your back pocket. It doesn't matter if it's not super up to date, because at the point you buy it, you'll have to get a new one anyway, but it gives you a good number to start with. And I personally didn't know how expensive some of those things can be until you approach the vendors and learn that information.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super important. And you know, when you come to visit and we as faculty tell you, contact us if you have any question, we really mean it. So feel free to contact us if you want to know what's available at the Institute. Katie was talking about expensive instrument. Maybe you cannot buy them. Maybe you can share it with someone else. So make sure you have all this information prepared. Thank you all so much. This is such an important topic, and I'm really happy you covered many aspects of it. So now we're going into a tricky question, and Rima's going to put it in the chat in a second. What to ask, what not to ask. And do you ask about expected salary or benefit? Katie, you're going to take us first answering this question, and then we're going to hear from Mayra. Katie, what should we ask or not ask?
Okay, so in my experience, the strategies I took were to initially, before any conversations, was to really research information that's available online. So at least in some states, state salaries are publicly available, and you can get that information online. And to also, as Karin mentioned, to think about a trusted colleague or somebody at the department that you resonated with that maybe offered to provide advice, to think about what do new faculty ballpark generally ask for as a startup package, to help you put some boundaries on the needs that you have and what will be realistic based on the institution that you have the offer from. I'd also like to add in the what to ask category, because some things are negotiables and some things are non-negotiables, to think about things that don't have a fixed dollar value but are just as important, including the spaces that you'll inhabit, that teaching release time, the number of students or the access to student RA or TA positions, and thinking about, while thinking about your academic salary, then also thinking about what summer salary might be available to kickstart research projects and get seed data for grants that you're writing. In the do not ask category, I've found this one quite challenging. The piece of advice I got was to not ask about salary at the interview stage, which is a general common kind of piece of advice, and to wait until you get an offer before you start that conversation.
That's a tricky one. I know. Mayra, would you like to add anything to the information we heard from Katie?
Yeah, I think what Katie's points were excellent. it's very hard to determine what not to ask. But I would say I agree with maybe waiting until you get an offer to start negotiating your salary. For a lot of universities, that information is public. And the same thing with the startup salaries or the startup package that you may get. So you can do research, and I agree that you should probably do that research before you go to your interview. So if there are questions that you need to ask, bring them during the interview, because at the end of the interview, you normally will get to sit with the hiring panel, and there will be some lingering questions from both ends. So that will be a really good opportunity to approach those. If you have a great department chair, which I do, our chair, he's amazing. He will try to actually help you build the best possible package, startup package. And the reason why is because they obviously want to retain you. I mean, finding a professor, it's hard. The whole process is very difficult and very involved. And also, keeping you is hard. So they want to make sure that you start on the right foot, right? I would say another thing that we didn't touch, but it's important, and it was touched in other workshops in this series, that is extremely important during that process, is if you're with someone and if you're bringing family, and if you have for example, you are dealing with a two-body problem, the startup is a good point for you to negotiate that other person's job. That was not my case, but it has been the case in the department, and I've also been participating in committees and hiring committees already. So that negotiation is a hard one to have, but it's an important one to have, because obviously if your family's not happy, you're not going to be happy, and you're probably not going to be very successful, and the department is not going to get from you what they need. So very important thing to bring to the conversation. I would say that in terms of what not to ask, I would say try to ask as much, be honest and ask questions. Just obviously be respectful on how you ask certain things. And I would say it's better to ask than not. But that's my approach.
I agree completely with that. Thank you so much. Natasha, would you like to add anything?
Yes, yeah. Just briefly, I think Katie and Mayra did a great job, so I'll just add some few minor additions. Again, assuming you've got the offer, you've done your homework, you've done your research. I think, as I think Mayra was saying, the worst they can say is no. So at least you've asked and got those questions off your chest. Some really good questions to ask, in addition to what both of them said, was when does your startup package expire? Is there an expiry date on that? Because that will help you think about how you're budgeting for certain things versus prioritizing some other things. International scholar, I needed to get an H-1B visa. So is the college, do they actually support H-1B visas? Because if they did not, that would not have worked out. So knowing that information is important. What are the expectations for tenure as well? I think we might talk about tips. This might fall in that as well, but essentially just figuring that out, because you're essentially planning your life for the next 3 to 5 years. So having all of that information is really, really helpful. Retirement, what are the retirement benefits? You usually end up talking to an HR person when you're doing the on-site interview, but by the time day 2 finishes, I was in a haze. I hardly remembered things. So always going back and re-asking those questions is, I think, encouraged. Something else, for example, I live in Los Angeles. The housing market is expensive. What are the housing options? Do they have faculty housing? Do they not have faculty housing? Is there a buy-in support for faculty to purchase housing? Just some of those things. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting other points that we normally don't get to think about. That's wonderful. All right, Katie, I'm going to ask you first. What are the common mistakes that can happen in a startup negotiation process? And you've done it 2 times in 2 different institutes. Can you think about any mistakes you've made in the first one that maybe you corrected in the second one, or stuff you didn't ask when you went to Texas Tech?
Sure, yeah. So when I was thinking about this question, my primary mistake would be to not negotiate, and that seems weird, but what I mean is to either submit your package and expect that that would be the end, or to have things be modified and then just accepting them, because I think that it's really okay and actually great to have a back and forth discussion, and on those Zoom conversations and phone calls that Natasha was talking about are really important, because as Mayra said, you're trying to find a mutually beneficial package that will help you succeed at the university that you are working with. And so going into the process expecting a back and forth, I think, is a way to avoid the mistake of putting something forward and then being disappointed or surprised or maybe elated. I don't know how that could work out, but the other aspect I thought about would be to avoid trying doing this alone, to talk to your mentor and advisor, get somebody outside of the institution to give you that external perspective, and talk to people who recently went through this, who maybe have a similar background to you in the things that you would require, right? If you're a really field-based person, what do you need versus a lab or computational? And the final point I would make is to not assume that salary is not negotiable. As Natasha said, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but you don't know about which one it is until you ask and you start that conversation. Those were the things that I thought maybe for that.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Natasha, would you like to add any information?
Yeah, definitely. And then, yeah, going back to what we've been talking about, take this as a business meeting, right? You're negotiating, you're in business, they expect you to negotiate. You should expect yourself to negotiate. So definitely ask the questions. You're advocating for yourself, for your students, to be the best scientist, best researcher, best faculty member. So just keep all of that in your mind, but also be gentle to yourself. It might seem intimidating, stressful. Don't feel pressurized or rushed into making these decisions. And then as Katie was saying, definitely relying on a network of mentors, other faculty members that you really trust. They don't necessarily have to be in geosciences. They can be in economic or biology. So I think like getting that completely external perspective also helps, because they might ask questions which might shed light to a new way of thinking about your startup that you necessarily haven't thought about. And I think both Mayra and Katie have said this, and I also have this in my notes: focus on mutual benefits, right? They want you want to be there. What's the win-win startup package or situation, or moving forward, what's the win-win situation? Review the final offer, right? So once you've done all of the negotiation, take some time and then actually take a moment, step back, and then come look at it from fresh eyes. If you have another offer, which is awesome, exciting, congratulations, use that offer to negotiate at the institute that you want to be, right? So you can play those with each other. And again, because it's a business negotiation, they expect you, or it's you're not going out of the rules or things like that, right? You can use that to your benefit. Instrumentation quotes, ask, call instrument people. If you're at conferences, there's usually like a IRMS, Thermo Scientific consultants there. Ask them for quotes, ask them like what the timeline on those quotes are. They're usually an year, so that might change, but so factoring all of that in, thinking about instrumentation quotes is also super beneficial. I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Mayra, would you like to add any information we haven't heard about this question? Common mistake.
I think make sure that you read. Yeah, I think this has been stressed several times already. Make sure that you read your offer. Make sure that you understand your offer. Don't rush into signing it. Even if it's a good offer, sometimes you'll see that in your offer, pockets of money are coming from different places. It may be like some part of that startup is coming from the dean's office, Maybe another comes from the research, the vice chancellor research. Maybe if you have a research center within your own institution, which is the case here at the University of Wisconsin. I had some funds coming from SIMS and SSEC. They come from different places. They all have different rules, and they have different rules as to how you can use them. So before you think about, I'm going to buy this expensive piece of equipment, or I'm bringing this student on board, make sure that you understand how and when you can spend that money. And yeah, that can be very confusing, especially if it's, you're new to the institution, you don't know all the rules. But yeah, sit down and make sure that you understand what those rules mean.
Thank you. And we're hoping to do at some point an event exactly talking about these things. So now you start, and what do you do? How do you start purchasing instrument and all these different codes and different accounts? So keep an eye on the future event for ESWN. We're hoping to have one exactly that cover that. All right, Natasha, I have a question for you, and then Katie and Mayra, I'm also gonna let you comment on that. Team number 4 is the startup in Teaching Institute and Research Institute similar? Is the expectation similar on what you can ask? Natasha, can you take that question first?
Absolutely. Short answer, no. They're different, right? The infrastructure is very different. To just give people an idea of size, for example, my college has around 130 faculty members in its entirety, and our student body is around 1,900, so just shy of 2,000 students. So very different. Keep that in mind, right? When you're making your startup budgets, when you're asking for instruments, you should not be, you're at the liberal arts institutes, you can't ask for multi-million-dollar instruments to have. That's just not viable. So I find that exciting because you end up being very creative in ways of thinking about ways of what are the instruments that you absolutely need. There's a lot of focus on having instruments that students can use, so keeping that in mind as well. So there are a lot of classes that I'm building and teaching where students are using these instruments, so they're getting the behind the scenes of how do you make calibration curves, what are standards. So definitely that is important. Something else that's different is also in terms of technicians. We have a technician for the entire department, not my lab, so keeping that in mind as well. So as a faculty member at liberal art institutes or liberal art colleges, you end up wearing multiple hats. So you're your own lab tech, your own administrator. So there's autonomy like I've never seen before, which is very exciting and also intimidating sometimes. So keep that in mind. So they are different, and expectations for tenure similarly are also different. There is weight that is given to teaching evaluations that students give at the end of every semester. Occidental does expect you to submit National Science Foundation research grants or other external grants. So there is that support as well to continue doing your research. In addition to that, there's a lot of, as Mayra was saying, there are a lot of pockets of money for undergraduate students for them to do research. So make sure you know what all of these different pockets of monies are at your college or university, because that money does end up adding up, and you can get dates or go do field work, for example. Our college has a lot of support for students doing international field work, so that helps because that's not a cost that's coming out of your startup. Yeah, so I would say those are the big major differences that I can think of.
All right, and they're definitely different. Katie, before I'm gonna ask you the same question, I'll just add, you can ask the chair, what is the startup? Sometimes they'll be kind enough to tell you, oh, university is expected to pay not more than X, or you can only, they might say, ask what you need for, but it would be good for you to know, like, what's my upper limit? Because it might be different from a teaching institute to a research institute, and that might put you in perspective. Do I need all these equipment, or can I submit at some point MRI? Can I share it with someone else? All right, I'll be quiet. Katie, can you tell us you had the experience of going through a teaching institute and then coming to a research institute. Did your startup look similar in both places?
As Natasha said, definitely not. But I thought about the biggest differences, and it's because of the different focuses. And for me, the biggest difference was you're thinking about at the Research Institute, the graduate student RAs and building your team. Is it going to be for one student for 2 years or a PhD student for 3 years? When is that student expected to arrive? Because as Mayra said, when you can use the money is very specific, and you want to make sure that if you need to be ready with the student salary day one, that you can be, or maybe you're going to do that in year 2. And to explore the scholarships and college and university opportunities that might be available for those graduate students. The possibilities available for a postdoc perhaps as well, and those personnel aspects of the startup are very important to helping you hit the ground running. So for me, I think that was possibly the biggest aspect to consider anew.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important information that we don't think about when we start to think about those negotiation part. Mayra, would you like to add any information for this team?
Yes, I am not very familiarized with teaching institutions, but I've talked to colleagues who work at teaching institutions, and we know that there are very clear differences. So I appreciate the experience that Katie and Natasha are bringing into this. What I would say is that regardless of where you're from, you may want to focus on what are the things that you need to move forward. What do you need to get tenure? And that sounds almost like a selfish thing to say, but the reality is that that's why you get a startup fund. It's for you to support your academic progress. And that depends on the institution. So for us, I think at that point, you also want to ask about what are the things that I need to get promoted, or how am I going to get evaluated? And that kind of is going to help you to guide what do you need to do with your startup. So for example, I can give you my experience. I was in between bringing a postdoc and a grad student. And I ended up using some of my startup to bring a grad student because that had more impact and more weight on what I was expected to do. So the other thing is the educational component. At research institutions, you do not necessarily have to use your own funding for the educational component. Let's say you wanted to buy a piece of equipment for a class. There are other ways to get funding for that. However, it is harder actually to justify in many cases. So work with your, and for example, for me, educating and teaching in the classroom is really important, regardless of. So that has been, luckily, again, as I mentioned, we have a very supportive department here and a very supportive department chair. So work with your institution if you need something that is outside of the scope of what your department does, but you think you need it in order to give a great class, or in the case where you are teaching primarily, if you need something for research, try to work, because sometimes you don't have to tap into your startup. There are other resources that you can use, and then you can save that money for other things.
Thank you. Very important points from all three of you. All right, we're going to wrap up our panel discussion with our last question, our last team. Do you have any tips for a successful negotiation for a startup before you're signing the contract? Anyone would like to take it first? Tips for successful negotiation before signing the contract. I know we talked about a lot of these things in the last 4 different teams. Are there any final thoughts or final ideas you think we should give our attendancy here to think about as they're making that final negotiation?
I can say be intentional with your research and where you want to go. And that does not mean that your research may take a different direction. Maybe you have a very clear vision as to what you want to do, and then eventually in year 1, you're like, yeah, not sure, let me start redirecting. But it's very important to be intentional, because that will let you know what you need. And then you can come up with a plan as to how you're going to use your startup. And again, ask questions. Don't do this alone. Sometimes it's easy for us to just get trapped behind our doors, and like, even if you don't have support at your own institution, or you feel a little bit scared about asking those questions, this is why we have a community here. Do not hesitate to reach out to another professor that's going through the same, and we'll help you, and we'll tell you what our mistakes were, and yeah, provide support.
Thank you. Natasha, do you want to add?
Yeah, so in addition to what Mayra was saying, you do not need to be doing this alone, right? Talk to people around you, ask faculty members for coffee in your institute. If that's not comfortable, maybe faculty member that you meet at a conference that you've connected with, just to make sure that, you're not alone. And then reaching out to people and asking for advice is super, super important. If there's a postdoctoral office in your institute, they usually have workshops or webinars. I attended 2 of those, and I found them super, super helpful. So definitely make use of any office availability that you have at your current institute. Start early with the wish list, right? You don't need to wait till the time you get an offer. As you're making those items, and as Mayra was saying, you'll realize that, oh, I actually don't need this. I need this, and it'll be like version 6 or version 7 that you feel very comfortable with. So definitely start early. Something else, if you get an offer and you're really excited about that, talk to other faculty members at that institute, right? Like, for example, in my personal case, our department chair gave me the email addresses for other faculty members that I could reach out to and talk to them about their experience, their startup. It is a very small department, so everybody knows each other. It's very intimate. So if you have that opportunity, definitely talk to faculty members at the institute that you're doing the negotiation with. Yeah, so that's it.
All right. Well, thank you. Katie, would you like to add any last thoughts for tips for successful process?
Sure. As kind of referenced before, you're putting in this different versions and your best holistic package. Just be sure that the one you submit is your best package forward first, so that you don't feel like you have to revise or add in extra things that you forgot maybe were important. And that can be like a good starting point for then the back and forth discussion. And to be aware that possibly things might be more expensive when you get there, because you make the startup package in the spring, and then by the time that fall rolls around or the next spring, things might happen. There might be unforeseen expenses, and so you might not get absolutely 100% on your list. But if you have that priority list and you know what is the absolute most critical parts, you can make sure that your startup really works for you and fits your research program the best.
We know you're all been waiting just for this part of the event.